But the U.S. story of oil is an important one for reasons I've already mentioned, but also because the U.S. is a kind of template. The U.S. has become the world's most explored region for petroleum. More oil wells have been drilled in the continental U.S. than in the rest of the world put together. So if we want to understand the oil industry, if we want to understand petroleum geology, start with the U.S., and you'll see how it's going to go for the rest of the world as soon as we get around to punching as many holes in other countries. And this is the story. U.S. oil discovery peaked around 1930 with some immense discoveries in East Texas. But discovery of new oil began to decline very quickly, and virtually no new oil is being discovered in the U.S. these days. A bit in the Gulf of Mexico, offshore in deep water, and there's still a bit to be found in Alaska. Other than that, it's simply not worth investing the time and effort to hunt for new oil in the U.S. It's virtually all been found. 40 years after the peak of discovery, the peak of production, or the peak of extraction, occurred. Now, this phenomenon of oil extraction peaks is something that's been pretty well studied by this time. It's clear that oil is a resource like many others that exists in the ground. It's of varying qualities. It takes effort and energy to get it out of the ground. It's in porous rocks and sometimes shallow, snaky reservoirs. So it's natural to go after the cheap, easy stuff first. And then after about the first half of the resource has been extracted, it becomes more difficult to extract the resource, and the rate of extraction peaks and begins to decline no matter how much effort is put into the process. Now, the peak may occur at exactly the halfway point, or somewhat before the halfway point, or slightly after. That's somewhat academic, but the general outline, the bell-shaped curve of production, seems to be true for every oil-producing reservoir, every oil-producing region, country, and will undoubtedly be true for the world as a whole. There's almost no dispute on that point. The only question is when exactly the global oil production peak is likely to occur. And so I'll talk about that in a moment, but it's worth following up on the U.S. oil production peak of 1970, simply to point out what a momentous event this was for modern American and, in fact, global economic history. After this date, after 1970, the U.S. becomes increasingly dependent on oil imports. By this time, we have created an oil-dependent way of life. We have created suburbia, after all. We have created a way of life that depends upon individual ownership of automobiles, that depends on plastics, that depends on agricultural chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all made from oil and natural gas. So very soon after the U.S. oil production peak, the importance of that is driven home by the Arab oil embargo of 1973, and then by the fall of the Shah of Iran in 79 and the beginning of the war between Iran and Iraq. These two events, of 1973 and 79, cause oil prices to skyrocket by 400% in 73 and by another 200% in 79. The economic shock waves reverberated around the globe, and these two events caused the largest global economic catastrophe since the Great Depression. So we learned that oil could, in fact, be used as a weapon. The story of the 73 embargo is a complicated one, and it's been heavily simplified by the media, but nevertheless, it was an important time in oil and economic history, and something happened as a result of that. We adapted. Because oil prices were higher, we increased our efficiency. national speed limits went down from 75 to 55 miles an hour on the freeways. We started insulating our homes better. Did 1,000 things to cause oil consumption to decline for the first time since 1859. Since that time, since the U.S. oil production peak in 1970, basically the same thing has happened in country after country. Remember, the U.S. is the template, and the rest of the world is sure to follow. Here's just one example, North Sea. Most of the discoveries of North Sea oil took place in the early 1970s and fell off quite rapidly after that. And this was extraordinarily good news for the 1970s because it meant that Western countries would not have to be so heavily dependent on oil from the Middle East. We had a source in friendly countries like the UK and Norway. It was great news for Great Britain, which had been, throughout the 1950s and 60s, been considered the, quote, sick man of Europe, because it had been in the economic doldrums since World War II and the loss of its empire. Well, North Sea oil was a huge economic shot in the arm for these countries, but North Sea oil has peaked. The region that's been explored and exploited by Great Britain probably peaked first. Norway peaked about in 2002. This year, 2004, Great Britain became, once again, for the first time in 30 years, a net oil importer. So every year, we see fewer nations in the column of oil exporters and more nations in the column of oil importers. Fewer exporters, more importers. Now, of about 45 significant oil-producing countries around the world, roughly 25 of them are past their peak. This is the chart published monthly and updated monthly by the Association for the Study of Peak Oil in the UK. This is a complicated chart and is worth some careful scrutiny, but we won't spend that much time with it now. Here you can see the contraction in oil consumption that occurred in the 1970s and early 1980s as a result of the price shocks. And since then, of course, demand and consumption have recovered and begun to soar. ASPO was projecting, as of just a few months ago, a global oil production peak for all liquids, including non-conventional sources, tar sands, heavy oil, and so on, for about 2015. But recent events, including the skyrocketing demand of the past 18 months, and news from Saudi Arabia, have resulted in ASPO's updating of its charts to predict a global oil production peak for 2007. Others are predicting as soon as 2005. Why these forecasts? Well, one way of getting a handle on when global oil production is likely to peak is to look at the peak in global oil discoveries. Remember, in the U.S., oil discovery peaked in 1930, roughly, and oil production peaked in 1970, about a 40-year time lag. Well, globally, oil discovery peaked in the early 1960s, around 63 to 64. This chart is from ExxonMobil. It's from the PowerPoint presentation of Henry Longwell, Exploration Vice President of ExxonMobil. Thank you very much, Henry. And so we can see